Okay, well, thank you. Good morning. Bonjour tout le monde. Senior Deputy Governor Wilkins and I are very pleased to be back to answer your questions about today's interest rate announcement and our monetary policy report. And I'll begin with a few remarks about the most important issues in the Governing Council's deliberations. L'économie canadienne continue de se remettre de la récession mondiale qui a fait suite à la crise et de la chute connexe de nos exportations. En même temps, elle s'est ajustée au prix plus bas du pétrole et d'autres produits de base, ainsi qu'un taux de change beaucoup plus faible. Tout au long de cette période, les vulnérabilités financières dans le secteur des ménages ont continué de s'accumuler. Rien de surprenant, donc, que les données n'aient pas fait ressortir clairement les forces économiques dominantes. Les exportations canadiennes ont été particulièrement variables et des prévisions révisées concernant les exportations ont été au centre de nos délibérations. Les exportations de biens ont plus que regagné le terrain perdu en 2007 à 2009, alors qu'elles avaient connu une baisse spectaculaire. Mais cette reprise a accusé un retard persistant par rapport à nos prévisions. Les excellents résultats obtenus du côté des exportations en 2015 ont renouvelé notre confiance. Mais elle a été ébranlée de nouveau au premier semestre de 2016, alors que l'on a enregistré un important recul à cet égard pendant 5 mois. In our July MPR, we advanced what we viewed as a conservative forecast for exports, in the sense that it assumed only that exports would grow roughly in line with the U.S. economy. We've seen a significant recovery in exports since then, but the net effect of these choppy data is that the level of exports is well below where we thought it would be by now. Now, it's important to note that international trade has been surprisingly weak globally, and we offer a box in this MPR discussing a range of interpretations. Also, the U.S. economy was quite weak in the first half of the year, in dimensions that are important to Canadian export demand. These factors explain about half of the shortfall in exports relative to what we were expecting. For the remainder, we are examining a range of structural factors, including lost export capacity and competitiveness challenges. Now, in our surveys, companies have mentioned a number of factors that can influence competitiveness or hinder exports directly. These include such things as deficient infrastructure, regulatory uncertainty, rising trade barriers, relatively high electricity costs, and the unknown status of current and future trade agreements. This analysis suggests to us that more of our export shortfall may be structural than previously believed, rather than cyclical. And this is what led us to indicate in our September decision that the risks around our July inflation projection were tilted to the downside. Our latest projections incorporate a permanent shortfall in exports relative to our understanding of fundamentals in order to rebalance our forecast risks, reducing the projected level of GDP by about 0.6% by the end of 2018 compared with our July forecast. Our research on this subject will continue. Le deuxième grand enjeu qui a été important dans nos délibérations était l'intervention récente du gouvernement fédéral visant le renforcement des marchés hypothécaires. Cette évolution est positive, car elle aidera à atténuer les vulnérabilités financières avec le temps. Nous nous attendons à ce qu'elle se traduise par une réduction des reventes de logements à court terme et peut-être par un déplacement vers la construction de logements plus petits. La conjugaison de ces deux effets entraînera une certaine baisse des dépenses dans l'économie. Bien que ces effets soient très incertains, nous avons incorporé un choc de moins 0,3% d'ici la fin de 2018. Cela correspond à environ la moitié de notre révision des perspectives concernant les exportations. Now, as you know, the bank thinks of these issues within a risk management framework. This framework acknowledges that economic forecasting brings with it inherent uncertainty around the outlook for inflation, and financial developments bring uncertainties around the implications for financial stability. Together, these factors generate a zone within which variations in either inflation outlook risks or financial stability risks may be tolerated. Now, the width of this zone is a function of those underlying uncertainties. For example, in the current context, the government's new mortgage rules should mitigate financial stability risks over time, thereby improving the risk trade-offs that we face within this zone. Now, after incorporating our new thinking around exports and taking into account the possible near-term effects on house resales of the new mortgage rules, our projections show a lower profile for economic growth, an extended period of economic slack, and a later return of inflation to the 2% target. Now, notice that when we say in our statement that we now consider the risks around our new inflation projection to be balanced, we are referring to projection risks, not to the performance of inflation relative to target. In our forecast, inflation will still trend below target so long as the economy is below full capacity, and we now project that to last longer than we did in July. Further extending the time during which the economy operates with excess capacity has multiple undesirable implications, such as discouragement of workers and labor market scarring. Now, given the downgrade to our outlook, Governing Council actively discussed the possibility of adding more monetary stimulus at this time in order to speed up the return of the economy to full capacity. However, we identified a number of significant uncertainties in the current context that are serving to widen the zone of balance within our risk management framework. Now, these include the macroeconomic effects of the new mortgage rules, the likely path of our exports, the impacts of the federal government's fiscal measures, which are just beginning to be felt, and the effects on business confidence of the U.S. election. Importantly, the government's actions to mitigate risks in the mortgage market were not seen as an impediment to easier monetary policy. Indeed, a combination of lower interest rates and a more stringent macroprudential policy would likely work to reduce both financial stability risks and the risk of an undershoot of inflation at the same time. This is because interest rate changes have their largest effect on inflation risk, while stronger macroprudential settings will lead to a higher quality of household indebtedness over time. Now, against this backdrop, Governing Council decided to leave our key policy interest rate unchanged, as we judged that the balance of risks at present are still within the zone for which the current policy setting remains appropriate. This judgment will be monitored carefully as more data become available and more clarity emerges around these uncertainties. I thank you for your attention. I know Carolyn and I would be happy to take your questions.
All right, first question, Greg Quinn, Bloomberg.
Good morning. You just mentioned you discussed a few things, risks, when you were looking at possibly adding new stimulus today. What was the most important factor that led you to stay on hold?
I think the primary thing is that the uncertainty that you face on a number of the respects that I've listed there has at least the potential to clear up more quickly than usual. When we talk about uncertainty around exports, we've been dealing with uncertainty about exports for quite some time. But we've just had a little bit of a run on exports that had for a few more months before you were dead certain, and you do some more research along the way, dead certain that that permanent adjustment downwards that we've taken truly is permanent. But that's our best judgment at this time. But that illustrates why it's worth having a little more time to examine some of these things. The other one I mentioned, which is obviously very near term, is uncertainties that may play on investment decisions, particularly in the U.S., but also in Canada, around the U.S. election process. That raises a lot of questions in people's minds if they're thinking about a major investment. And so it's natural for people to delay those decisions until afterwards. And right now, what we've done in this forecast is we've incorporated a lower track for investment spending in the United States. It has a direct impact on our outlook for exports in Canada. And so that judgment is something that we could return to in the coming months as things clarify.
Do you see this as that the worst is passing from the oil shock, and how much confidence do you have in saying that the worst might be over after the drop in oil prices?
Well, when we talk about the bottoming process, we're primarily talking about investment. Investment was the first major thing that was cut in the wake of the lower oil prices for obvious reasons. And those investment decisions had direct employment effects because a lot of those investments are carried out through suppliers, service suppliers such as drillers, folks that build rigs. And then the spillovers went everywhere else through the manufacturing sector. So we see that investment has fallen by on the order of 60%. We've talked to people, that was their estimate for some time now. And now in our surveys, they're telling us, yeah, we think that most of that work has been done. Like just to maintain a reasonable level of production, you pretty well have to stop cutting investment. So in our analysis of this, along the way, we've talked a couple of times about a 3 to 5 year adjustment process. So we're obviously well into that adjustment process, and so it's kind of following that kind of pattern. But the other side of this is that we're still absorbing as a country a reduction of gross national income in the order of $60 billion a year. Now, some of that, of course, has already been recognized through those adjustments I just talked about. But the other side of this is a much slower, more spread out process that affects perhaps everywhere in the country as we get sort of slower wage growth, some more employment effects perhaps as those income levels continue to absorb that. Some of it is absorbed by the companies, obviously. But eventually that ends up being in the employees. So we've seen only some of that now, and so we expect still for those adjustment processes to linger. And as I've said before, it takes time for someone to decide that their prospects have changed sufficiently that they want to move. For example, if you want to move your family from Alberta to somewhere else in Canada, depending on where the destination is, it's a pretty big decision, obviously, and for all folks. So that's that personal adjustment process that takes a lot longer. So I think we can't say it's over, so to go back to your question, but we do think that the major effects on GDP have been absorbed, and after this, it should be a much more gradual, and in fact, almost invisible, but like a headwind that's not really easy to put your finger on.
Okay, next question, Kim Racco, Wall Street Journal.
Thanks. Governor Bullis, thanks for taking these questions. I wanted to ask about exports in particular, and you've spoken in the past about an export puzzle, a puzzle around figuring out why they've been lower than expected. The discussion around competitiveness in the MPR, is that something that you see as solving that puzzle? Is it the answer to those questions that have been lingering?
Well, as economists with our models, usually those kinds of things are represented in the way we do in Chart 11, or 12, I guess. Sorry, I got it wrong. Chart 12, where we think of the main ingredients to competitiveness are basically your costs, your productivity, so your wage costs, your productivity, and then adjusted by exchange rates. That's kind of the textbook measure of competitiveness from a macro standpoint. When we look at the export puzzle, we of course have competitiveness measured that way in our models. That's not new. We look to cyclical things that we think could be things that we've missed or have been, if you like, aggregated out during the process of modeling. So for instance, say you had global GDP in your model driving Canadian exports. You may benefit by decomposing global GDP into the U.S., China, India, and then the rest of the world, or something like that. That would be an empirical exercise you'd go through to try and improve your modeling. Because why? Because some countries are expanding differently than others, and so that affects your export outlook differently than you expected in the aggregate measure. So when we look through all that, the U.S. investment story, that sort of thing, we have identified a number of improvements, if you like, through that modeling exercise that kind of help us explain around half of what we've been dealing with. So just like in the Sherlock Holmes mystery, like when you've gone to all the obvious things, it must be the least obvious thing that's left, like that are hard to measure. And why we talk about competitiveness in a broader sense. And these are the kinds of impediments that companies have mentioned to us that are affecting their ability to grow their business. Carolyn, do you want to add anything about that?
Sure. Well, you know what the governor's talking about when we talk to companies is it's pretty consistent across the country in the sense that they're going to look at wages and they're going to look at the value of the dollar just like we have in our chart, but they're also going to be looking at where they're going to locate their capacity and other aspects like electricity prices, the availability of the right labor for what they need, buy American. Those kinds of factors are going to, the time it takes to get a project approved, those are the kinds of things that factor into their longer term investment decisions that really matter as well.
And just to follow up, when you talk about some of these more structural issues to export growth limits, what implications does that have for the bigger story that the bank has been talking about around the structural adjustment toward more non-resource export-led growth?
Well, I think just to begin, it's important to note that many of the things on that list, someone could say, that's really affecting my business. And we say, well, okay, that kind of goes into the bucket of things that we should know, but they're not modelable. Okay, it's not like we have a history of those kinds of events that can allow us to calculate some kind of historical relationship between those things and how exports behave. So it's more, they have to kind of go in an other category or your residual category. And so, an economist would explain as best they can what they see in the data and say, I can't explain the rest. And say, well, do you think, so then we have to try to reach a judgment, is it long-lasting, structural, or is it just noise that could go away? Hence our wish to, watch the export data carefully in the coming months to see if, maybe in the second quarter things were unusually depressed and that's just noise and we get some offsets, those kinds of issues. So how does it change our story? Well, as we laid out today, we've taken that much of this and said that probably is related to structural things that we can't really adjust for. And so we've put them into our baseline. And that means there's a permanent gap between what we used to think and what we are thinking now. And so that is the main reason why our outlook is softer now. It's not just about the outlook, it's about what's already occurred. So we start lower. So our starting point is lower. And despite the recovery the last couple of months, we're still well below. So we start our forecast from there, and we're keeping about half of that as a permanent decline. And if we get lucky, then we'd get some of it back. But at this stage, we can't really predict that, and we are doing some more modeling. That's why we haven't put out a major paper on this yet, because there are a number of other avenues of research that we'd like to pursue before we get closer to tying a bow. I want to mention also one that we have talked about in the past, which is the lost export capacity in the past. We know we lost 8,000 or 10,000 firms during the strong dollar period, and it's followed by the global recession, and many of those were exporting firms. So we always thought we would have a different response to stronger growth in the U.S. and a lower exchange rate, that it wouldn't respond in the normal way our model has, because there's a big difference in who's in it. And so we speculated at times, well, maybe the process will be slower, Okay, so maybe it's just going to happen, but it's slower, or maybe it'll be less. You know, so those are the kinds of questions that you really can't be definitive about. So we're being very open about that. This is how we're dealing with it, and I think that in the end, if you look at the big picture, exports went down tremendously in 2008, 2009, and they've more than recovered. And most of that is exactly what our models say should happen. But along the way, the growth rate persistently was less than what we thought should happen. And it's gradually building up to something that we've got to acknowledge, and we've got to say, well, either it comes back someday after firm creation kicks in more strongly or something, or for now, we're going to assume it's permanent.
Okay, next question, La Presse.
Bonjour. Sur les exportations, encore une fois, vous avez expliqué que certaines entreprises qui étaient autrefois des exportatrices fabriquent désormais dans leur marché, qui étaient autrefois des marchés d'exportation. Deuxièmement, il y a beaucoup d'entreprises qui étaient de très grands exportateurs qui sont disparus dans les technologies de l'information, notamment Nortel, JDS Uniphase et bien d'autres. Est-ce que cela signifie que finalement vous surestimez peut-être les capacités de production non utilisées? Vous les mettez à peu près à 1,5 %. Il y en aurait peut-être moins si on tient compte du nouveau profil sur lequel vous faites des recherches pour les entreprises exportatrices. Et deuxièmement, quand est-ce que vous pensez avoir un tableau beaucoup plus précis de ce qu'est la nouvelle réalité des exportations canadiennes?
Mais je vais commencer et après, j'imagine que Caroline aura quelque chose à ajouter. Il y a un grain qui est important, c'est-à-dire qu'après une période comme on a eu, il y avait en fait la destruction de la capacité. C'est presque la même chose dans notre modèle qu'on a vu durant le choc pétrolier, parce qu'on abandonne quelques projets, et ça c'est un effet de la destruction, ou peut-être de temps en temps, c'est hibernation à la capacité. Dans les secteurs que vous avez mentionnés, secteur électronique par exemple, c'est très ambigu, parce que, par exemple, la sortie de Nortel a laissé le capital humain, les laboratoires, etc., et fonctionne aujourd'hui avec pour les autres entreprises. Alors, les opérations de fabrication étaient hors le pays pour la plupart. Alors, c'est une question compliquée, mais on ajuste le potentiel dans un sens agrégat, pas dans la micro. Caroline.
Mais effectivement, comme vous dites, si les exportations la croissance est plus faible, et puis c'est pour des raisons structurelles, évidemment, à travers le temps, ça va avoir une implication pour le potentiel. Et on va en tenir compte de ça. Ce qu'on fait actuellement quand on mesure le potentiel, c'est de regarder ça de façon macro. On a une formule structurelle qui quand même peut tenir compte des investissements, donc le rétablissement de la capacité. Donc, à fur et à mesure qu'il y a moins d'investissements, puis moins de nouvelles entreprises qui sont créées, on tient compte de ça et puis on l'a fait enfin au mois d'avril. On a révisé la baisse, le potentiel pour cette raison-là. Donc, on essaie de réviser le potentiel moins fréquemment que notre prévision actuelle parce que c'est un concept qui évolue de façon plus lente que la demande actuelle. Donc, mais c'est un bon point.
Mais juste, est-ce que vous avez une idée précise de quand vous allez avoir complété votre réflexion sur la nouvelle donne pour les exportations? Vous dites que ça pose des défis. Nous examinons une gamme de facteurs structurels.
Oui.
Alors, à un moment donné, il y a des conclusions. Quand pensez-vous avoir ces conclusions-là?
Oui, pour le moment, une prévision serait qu'il serait pas possible d'expliquer toutes ces choses, mais On va essayer en effet, de faire l'arithmétique pour estimer quelle taille on doit assigner à cet facteur ou un autre facteur. C'est probablement pas une question empirique dans le sens ordinaire, qu'on a un modèle qui est ajusté et voilà un modèle qui explique tout. Mais en principe, l'approche est de désagréger, d'avoir plus de détails pour avoir les secteurs qui fonctionnent normalement et les autres qui ne fonctionnent pas normalement, et d'expliquer ça. C'est en fait l'approche qu'on a utilisée dans le passé, à tirer les 500 secteurs qui ont diminué vers zéro, mais les autres secteurs étaient parfaitement normaux. Et on a dit, par exemple, ces secteurs sont plus sensibles au taux de change et les autres ne sont pas, etc. Et ça nous donne une compréhension. Mais au fond, il reste une erreur qui est attribuée à ces autres choses parce que c'est la seule raison qui reste. Et, il prend plus de temps pour avoir les réponses. Probablement durant l'hiver, on aura plus de recherches.
Okay, next question, Peter Livesquat.
I notice in your risks to the inflation outlook, you have weaker household spending stemming from high level of household indebtedness. But that leaves like the big elephant in the room, which was total indebtedness in the economy relative to the size of the economy. I'm thinking of other debts like corporate debt, a combination of all levels of government debt, and Canadian bank assets in particular relative to GDP. Wouldn't it make more sense to look at debts in total relative to the size of the economy when assessing risks to the inflation outlook? And do you do so? And if so, why not? Or why?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that when you look at the full picture of future evolution of the economy, you need to look at indebtedness of different parties. And so what we try to do in that particular section, though, is look at the risks that are top of mind. There's so many that you could list. We picked the ones that we think are top of mind, and we focused on consumer debt just because it's been rising so much, and it has reached levels that we've assessed in our financial system review for a long time now as being quite important. In fact, that sector's the principal risk to financial stability in Canada. And so, and what we're trying to say there is that households, making the link between that indebtedness and the possibility that at one point they may decide to have higher savings rates. And if they have higher savings rates, they're going to have lower consumption, all else being equal. And so the focus on consumer debt is really because we're focusing on household consumption in that particular risk.
Let me follow up. I'm thinking in particular with the problems that Deutsche Bank is having right now in the Italian banking system about the size of the Canadian bank's assets relative to GDP, which when I last called the Canadian Bankers Association, they don't even track. Isn't that a risk that the Bank of Canada should be having on its book?
Well, when we do it's in our view, it's not a macro risk. It's not a risk to the outlook. That's why we haven't listed it. It's certainly not one that's on our minds. The Canadian banks, their assets as a share of GDP is much less than in other economies like the UK, for example. I don't have the number in my head. But I think what's most important when you look at the risks that emanate from a financial sector, and in particular the banks, relates to the quality of the assets on their balance sheet and the quality of the capital that they have in place. And in terms of the Canadian banks, it's excellent. And their liquidity positions, their leverage positions are also excellent. And the oversight that they receive from the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions keeps them on a straight line.
So I think your most important point there is that it's about leverage, yeah. And that is simply not our issue. So in fact, the Canadian banks have sizable international businesses, and those businesses create a lot of jobs here in Canada. So in terms of comparing the ratio of their assets to GDP, they're affecting both the top and the bottom in a significant way. So I think you need to keep that context in mind, and I wouldn't even come close to drawing a comparison with the examples that you're laying out.
Okay, next question, Rahul.
Thank you for taking my question. Just regarding the new housing measures, the 0.3% drop in GDP by the end of 2018, could there not be a bigger impact, more immediate, in 2016 or 2017 from the new federal housing measures? And you know, given those measures, does that not give you you know, more scope to cut rates if for you know, greater longer term benefits, which the reduction of financial vulnerabilities will give you with the new measures, but the impact on housing and consumption could be a bigger hit, more immediate?
So we've said very clearly in the MPR that we consider that 0.3 to be a highly uncertain figure. So it's true, I suppose, it could be bigger, but it also could be smaller. So it's very hard to do this. Imagine with the process that we will go through. The comparisons we make today are how do people react if they need to stress test their mortgage proposal using the Bank of Canada posted rate, which is a couple of points higher than otherwise. Well, okay, so what if the posted rate gets adjusted through this? How does that change your analysis? If somebody is told, okay, this is how much of a mortgage you can afford, do they go out and still shop for a house but buy a less expensive house? Possibly a smaller house or somewhere else or something like that? In which case, maybe there's a much smaller effect than what we're describing. So there's so many moving parts in that analysis. I just don't want to hang our hat on this 0.3 and of course put it the other side. We would not make a policy decision without seeing how the economy actually reacts. So that's what I mean by the uncertainties that we face. It's true that our best guess is that it'll slow down housing resales, but it may not. So. Carolyn, to add something?
Yeah, I mean, the macro implications, we have to make assumptions about how many we think wouldn't have qualified or will no longer qualify based on historical data. We have to look at what we think the behavior might be. Do they wait longer? Do they instead buy a smaller house? And then we need to take into account that this is a change in terms of trying to restrict the quality of borrower to borrowers that can actually afford the mortgage. It doesn't change the underlying fundamentals of the market. So demographic demand are the same. The supply constraints that are there are the same. And so you still have that solid foundation in some of the areas that we've been worried about. But you do have this change in behavior. So what we've built in is a little bit of weighting, lower resales, smaller houses. And that's what we end up. And we do think, though, the timing of that is more likely to be sooner rather than later. So the reduction is more front-end loaded, but it ends up at minus 0.3 by the end of our forecast. I mean, in terms of the quality, the other part of your question, though, and I'll hand it back to you, but in terms of financial stability, what that really does is it changes the mix in quality of borrowers that are out there and improves it. And so that's why we say over time that the financial vulnerabilities will be dampened from what they would otherwise be. So I think the other advantage, and we've said this before, that macroprudential tools are better than monetary policy. We said that, and you can see in the design of these particular tools that they're targeting the actual issue. So it's not a change in an interest rate that affects consumption more broadly. It's really affecting a part of the financial system that we thought was risky, and we've talked about the rising levels of indebtedness and those who have debt service ratios that are climbing pretty high.
Well, it's also aimed at, I mean, if there's a cost to the economy in the near term, it's almost like paying insurance, buying some insurance, because what we're working there is to mitigate the risk that something quite severe could happen. as outlined in the RFSR. So if those vulnerabilities that we've identified meet up with a global shock, say a new slowdown in the world, or even a recession, that those effects on Canada would be magnified a lot by that indebtedness and the quality of the indebtedness. And so by paying a bit of a price there, you help avoid at least something that could be much worse for the economy. And therefore, it's a good deal.
Next question, Andrea Hopkins, Reuters.
To follow up on my colleague's question, doesn't the macroprudential change on housing give you more room to cut rates if you have to?
So as I said in my opening statement, we certainly we saw that the change would not be on the list of impediments to a change in policy at this time. Indeed, it changes that trade-off that we talked about within the zone of balance in the risk management framework. So all things equal, it reduces financial, over time at least, it would mitigate, I shouldn't say reduces, because it mitigates risks that could still be growing, but it should be growing by less, and may actually stop that growth or reduce them. But at this time, what we'll say with certainty is it will mitigate the risks that we've identified in the FSR, and that does take one of those, it eases that constraint if there was a constraint operating. And in the opening remarks, I also mentioned that if you'll accept that interest rates have their primary impact on the economy, and macroprudential moves have their primary effect on financial stability, then you've got the appropriate assignment of tools to the problem that you're trying to address. And so having them work together, such as having low interest rates, which cause people to wish to borrow more, but at the same time having a macroprudential framework which ensures that the quality of new borrowing will be higher than in the past, those two things working together gives us a better outcome.
Staying on housing and looking at the rotation in the economy, do you have concern that the housing sector that's sort of held up growth for as long as it has will stop contributing to growth or detract from growth before exports or commodities recover, leaving Canada without a significant engine for growth? In other words, you have some optimism. Every MPR you downgrade forecasts, but say, oh, there's some optimism for the future.
Yes.
Where do you find that?
So that's exactly what we have in our forecast, Andrea. So if I refer you to Table 2, which shows the contributions to GDP growth from all the main parts. So housing is actually forecast to become a drag on growth in 2017, a modest one, but minus 0.2 percentage points. And that's from a plus 0.2 in 2016. So that's taking, it's a move of 0.4 percentage points in that space that you're describing. So, but at the same time, our modest assumptions or forecast actually of exports shows a pretty good rebound, but contributing up to about 0.8 percentage points next year from around half that, or 0.2 this year. So this year we have that big negative quarter, Q2 in exports, and without that we would have had a decent contribution from exports, and we're just, as I said before, conservatively expecting that trend to continue along with the U.S. economy and give us closer to 0.8 next year. So that switch that you discussed is right there in there. We're not assuming housing continues to support the economy.
With respect to, you've expected that export growth to happen, and private sector economists are madly downgrading U.S. growth numbers that are due out imminently.
Yes.
Why would you expect U.S. growth to help demand, to help exports, when you've expected that before and it hasn't come to pass?
Well, so we have of course have incorporated downgrades today in our own U.S. Outlook, so that's part of our forecast also, and so it's only forecast to grow in that sort of 2% growth track, similar to Canada's. So there's nothing extraordinary in that story that is looks particularly risky to me. And as I said, looking down into the deeper analysis of exports, we've taken a significant cut to our outlook for exports based on this new analysis. And my judgment is, our judgment is that that gives us a very conservative track. I agree that we've said something like that in the past, and we were very disappointed with the few months that we saw earlier this year, and it's proved very hard to explain those data. So, as I've said before, some of that is in residual. We've taken some of it on board as a permanent decline to make sure that we have a balanced risk around that forecast.
Okay, last question. We have time for one more. Andy Blatchford, CP.
How have your expectations evolved when it comes to the magnitude and timing of the impacts from the government's fiscal measures, in particular when it comes to infrastructure?
Go ahead.
We have the same expectations with respect to the fiscal measures, so that by the end of the fiscal year 2017, 2018, it would be raise the level of GDP by 1%. That's coming from both the infrastructures you mentioned, but also from the Canada Child Tax Benefit. We haven't, well, I think we're starting to see the effects of those, but they're not showing up in the data yet. So we expect that it will start to show up in the data starting in Q3 and especially in Q4 and as we move forward. But our expectations haven't changed materially. There's a slight shift you'll see in the MPR where we discuss a little bit of a shift in the infrastructure, but it's not something that, it's just a small timing thing. It's not something that affects the endpoint.
Just lastly, I was wondering, how closely has the bank looked at the economic potential of boosting immigration, and what are your thoughts on how increasing the numbers can help economic growth?
Well, we're on record as saying that in this environment, our potential output line is growing at about 1.5%. That's inside of this forecast. So when we have a quarter like we think we just finished, that's going to be above 3% growth. That's pretty exciting compared to 1.5%. And it means that that 2% or a little above 2% actually closes that gap at a pretty steady pace next year. But longer term, what we need to be thinking about is what policies will allow us to get that trend line to tilt up. And when you start at 1.5%, if a policy were available that would increase it by 0.1 or 0.2, it may sound like a rounding error in the big picture, and yet when your trend line is only 1.5 to start with, 1.7 sounds a lot better. Okay, and it has a very big meaning to society. So policies like trade agreements or interprovincial trade agreements look quite significant in that, viewed through that lens. And this is where immigration fits. And not just immigration, but labor force participation more generally. So we know that there's 100,000 or more, close to maybe 120,000 folks in the 15 to 25 year age group that have become discouraged and have left the workforce. They're not part of the unemployment rate because they're not counted as part of the workforce. Some may be spending more time in school to try and have a better match of their skill set with what's available. But that's a cohort that we know didn't take early retirement. That's a cohort that is there as sort of hidden potential that is not captured. And so we believe that as we get closer to closing the gap, then the conditions in the labor market you're going to draw more of those folks back in. And that's the sort of thing which can give you more potential at the time. Immigration is a key ingredient to that trend line. I think immigration accounts for, on the order, I'm going to say 0.5 of our labor force growth, something like that, in that order. And it could be out by a decimal point. We'll admit it right now, but it's in that ballpark. And so, if you're going to raise that trend line, there are things like structural policies that the IMF is always emphasizing. Make your economy work better, take the impediments away that are slowing growth for us. And the ingredients. The ingredients are like immigration or improving labor force participation, whether it's for youth or for women or for folks who are in prime age who have been, disenfranchised by structural changes. So all those things, all those policies as a basket can have very, very good long-term benefits to the economy. If you could bump that up by 0.5, from 1.5 to 2, that would have an enormous effect on the viability of pensions, how much income people earn in their lifetimes, how much the economy grows in level terms. Think of it over a generation. It's a very, very big difference. So immigration fits in there that way as the economics picture. There's lots of other questions to ask around immigration, but for the economist, it's one of the ingredients of how that trend line is developed.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.